The diesel engine roared to life, black smoke billowing from the exhaust stack as Grandpa gripped the controls. I watched from the porch as that massive yellow bulldozer lurched forward, its steel blade gleaming in the morning sun. Sheriff Corinne stood 50 yards away, her hand on her radio, screaming into it about destruction of property and arrest warrants. But Grandpa did not stop. He had tried being reasonable. He had tried following the law. Now the law was going to follow him. The chain-link fence that had blocked our family road for 3 weeks was about to meet 80 years of righteous fury and 10 tons of American steel. My name is Jake Morrison, and I want to tell you about the day my grandfather became a local legend. But to understand what happened, you need to know about our road. Not just any road, but the narrow dirt path that had connected our family property to the main highway for over 60 years. Grandpa built that road himself in 1963, right after he came home from his second tour overseas. He was 25 then, fresh out of the Army Corps of Engineers, with calloused hands and a head full of dreams about raising a family in peace. He bought 40 acres of rolling farmland outside Millerville, population 847, and set about making it home. The property sat back from the main road, separated by a quarter-mile of thick woods and a creek that ran year-round. Most folks would have just built closer to the highway, but Grandpa wanted privacy. He wanted space for his children to run and play without worrying about traffic. So he spent 3 months that summer cutting through those woods, laying gravel and building a proper road. A man's road is his lifeline, he used to tell me when I was little, sitting on his lap while he drove the old pickup truck to town for supplies. You take away a man's road, you might as well lock him in a cage. For 60 years, that road served our family well. It brought Grandpa home from work every evening, covered in sawdust from the lumber mill. It carried my grandmother to the hospital when she went into labor with my father. It brought me home from school every day during the years I lived with them after my parents divorced. But the road was not just ours. That was the beautiful thing about rural life back then. Neighbors looked out for each other. The Hendersons used our road as a shortcut to their back pasture. Old Mrs. Clemens took it when her arthritis was acting up and she needed the shorter route to town. During hunting season, dozens of locals would ask permission to use it, and Grandpa always said yes. "Good neighbors make good fences," he would say, "and good fences make good neighbors." The road had an easement, filed properly with the county back in 1963. Grandpa was thorough about things like that. He understood that legal paperwork mattered, even in a small town where everyone knew everyone and handshake deals were still common. That easement gave us the legal right to cross the narrow strip of land between our property and the highway, no matter who owned the surrounding acres. For 6 decades, nobody questioned that right. The land around our easement changed hands a few times over the years, but the new owners always respected the arrangement. It was just how things worked in Millerville. People respected each other's needs and found ways to get along. Then Sheriff Corinne arrived. Corinne Blackwood came to Millerville in January, hired as our new sheriff after the old one retired. She brought with her 15 years of big city policing experience and what she called a modern approach to law enforcement. The town council was impressed by her credentials and her promises to crack down on what she termed rural lawlessness. I met her for the first time on a Tuesday morning in March. I was driving to town for groceries, taking our usual route down the family road when I saw the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. I pulled over, confused. I had not been speeding. My truck was inspected and registered. I could not imagine what I had done wrong. Sheriff Corinne stepped out of her patrol car wearing a crisp uniform and mirror-polished boots that looked like they had never seen a day of real work. She was maybe 40 years old, with short blonde hair pulled back severely and eyes like chips of ice. Everything about her screamed authority and zero tolerance. "License and registration," she said without any greeting or explanation. I handed over my documents, still puzzled. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" She studied my license for a long moment before looking up at me. "This road you are traveling on, do you have permission to be here?" The question hit me like a slap. Permission. I had been using this road my entire life. My grandfather built it. Our family owned the easement. "This is our family road," I explained patiently. "We have an easement. Has been filed with the county since 1963. Sheriff Coren's expression did not change. "I will need to see documentation of that easement. Until then, I am going to have to ask you to use the main highway for your travels." My temper started to rise, but I kept it under control. "Sheriff, with respect, my family has been using this road for 60 years. Everyone in town knows that." "Things change," she said, handing back my license. "I am not interested in how things used to be done. I am interested in how they are going to be done now, legally and properly." She wrote me a warning citation for trespassing on private property and told me she expected to see proof of easement rights within 30 days. As she drove away, I sat in my truck trying to process what had just happened. In all my years, no one had ever questioned our right to use our own road. That evening, I told Grandpa about the encounter. He listened quietly, his weathered face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, staring out the kitchen window toward the road he had built with his own hands. "She does not understand how things work here," he said finally, "but she will learn." Over the next few weeks, I heard similar stories from other longtime residents. Sheriff Coren was issuing citations for things that had never been problems before: parking violations for trucks left on Main Street overnight, noise complaints for roosters crowing too early, trespassing charges for kids taking shortcuts through empty lots they had used for generations. She was systematically dismantling the informal agreements and understandings that had held our community together for decades. And she seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting the older residents, the people who remembered how things used to be. But none of us realized how far she was willing to go until the morning we woke up and found the fence. It was a Thursday in late April when I discovered what Sheriff Coren had been planning. I left the house early that morning, heading to town for a doctor's appointment, taking the same route I had traveled thousands of times before. But when I reached the spot where our road met the main highway, I slammed on the brakes and stared in disbelief. A chain-link fence stretched across our road, 8 feet high and topped with razor wire. A large sign hung from the center: "Private property, no trespassing, violations will be prosecuted." Below that, in smaller print: "By order of Millerville County Sheriff's Department." I got out of my truck and walked to the fence, my hands shaking with anger and disbelief. The posts were set in concrete. This was not some temporary barrier or mistake. Someone had invested serious time and money to cut off our access to the main road. My phone rang. It was Grandpa. "Jake, you need to get back here right now." His voice was tight with controlled fury. "We have got company." I drove back to the house as fast as our winding road would allow. In the driveway, I found Sheriff Coren's patrol car and a black sedan I did not recognize. Through the kitchen window, I could see Grandpa sitting at the table, his face like carved stone, while Sheriff Coren and a man in an expensive suit talked at him. I walked into my own kitchen to find Sheriff Coren explaining property law to the man who had spent 60 years respecting it. "Mr. Morrison," she said when she saw me. "I was just explaining to your grandfather that the access road you have been using crosses private property belonging to Mr. Davidson here." She gestured to the suit-wearing stranger. "Mr. Davidson purchased the land 2 weeks ago and has decided to restrict access." The man named Davidson looked uncomfortable but determined. "Nothing personal," he said to Grandpa, "but I paid good money for this land, and I want to control who uses it." I found my voice. "We have an easement. It has been on file with the county for 60 years. Sheriff Karen smiled coldly. "Easements can be challenged. Mr. Davidson has hired an attorney to review the validity of your claim. Until that review is complete, you are trespassing on his property." Grandpa spoke for the first time since I had arrived. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of barely controlled rage. "How much did you pay him, Sheriff?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Davidson's face flushed red. Sheriff Karen's jaw tightened. "I do not know what you are implying, old man, but I would watch your tone if I were you." Grandpa stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame still imposing despite his 80 years. "I am implying that you found yourself a buyer for that strip of land, convinced him to challenge our easement, and put up that fence to force a legal battle you think we cannot afford to fight." "That is a serious accusation," Sheriff Karen said, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. "I could arrest you for harassment of a police officer." "You could try," Grandpa replied calmly. "But first you might want to explain to Mr. Davidson here that easements in this county are protected by state law, and that fence of his is about to cost him more money than he bargained for." Davidson looked nervously between them. "Sheriff Blackwood, you assured me this would be a simple matter of property rights." "It will be," she said, but her confidence seemed forced. "The court will sort it out." After they left, Grandpa and I sat in the kitchen, processing what had just happened. Our family was essentially trapped on our own property, forced to take a 12-mile detour through back roads to reach town. Emergency services would have the same problem reaching us. We were being deliberately isolated and harassed by the very persons sworn to protect and serve our community. "What are we going to do?" I asked. Grandpa was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the road he had built. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a decision that chilled me to the bone. "First, we are going to try to do this the right way, legal and proper just like she wants. But if that does not work," he paused, his eyes settling on something outside, "well, I still have the old bulldozer in the barn." The next morning, I found Grandpa in his study, surrounded by boxes of paperwork that had not seen daylight in decades. He had spent the night digging through property deeds, survey maps, and legal documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he methodically built his case. "Found it," he said when he saw me, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. "Original easement agreement, signed by the county clerk in 1963. Legal description matches our survey exactly. That fence is sitting on our legal right-of-way." I sat down across from him, amazed by the thoroughness of his preparation. The kitchen table was covered with documents arranged in neat piles, property records, correspondence with previous landowners, even photographs of the road's construction from 60 years ago. "Grandpa, this is incredible. With all this documentation, any lawyer should be able to get that fence removed in a matter of days." His expression darkened. "Should be able to, yes. But Sheriff Karen is not playing by normal rules. She has something personal invested in keeping us trapped back here." He pulled out another folder, this one containing printouts from internet searches. "I did some research on our new sheriff last night. Turns out she left her previous job under interesting circumstances." The documents told a troubling story. In her previous jurisdiction, Sheriff Karen had been involved in several controversial cases involving property seizures and code enforcement. Multiple complaints had been filed against her for harassment of longtime residents, particularly elderly property owners. She had resigned just ahead of a formal investigation into her conduct. "She has done this before," Grandpa said, his voice heavy with disgust. "She targets people she thinks cannot fight back. Older folks, people without money for lawyers, anyone she thinks will just give up and move away." I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would she want us to move? What does she gain from this? Grandpa spread out a county development map from the previous year. Our property was outlined in red, along with several neighboring parcels. "Look at this. Someone has been buying up land all around us. Small parcels, farms that have been in families for generations, all sold in the last 18 months, all to the same development company." The pattern was clear once you saw it. Our property sat right in the middle of what would make an ideal location for a large development project. With our access road blocked, we would be isolated and pressured to sell. "She is working with developers," I said, the pieces falling into place. "She harasses longtime residents until they sell cheap, then her friends buy up the land for pennies on the dollar." "That would be my guess," Grandpa agreed. "And we are probably the biggest obstacle to their plans. 40 acres of prime development land, held by stubborn people who will not sell." Over the next few days, we tried the legal route. Grandpa hired the best attorney in the county, a man named Robert Chen who specialized in property law. Chen reviewed our documents and confirmed what we already knew. Our easement was legally solid and had been properly maintained for 60 years. But when Chen tried to file an injunction to remove the fence, he ran into unexpected obstacles. The court clerk claimed the paperwork was incomplete. The judge's schedule was mysteriously full for weeks. County officials who should have been helpful were suddenly unavailable or uncooperative. "Someone is pulling strings," Chen told us during a frustrating phone call. "I have been practicing law in this county for 20 years, and I have never seen this level of bureaucratic stonewalling." Meanwhile, our situation was getting desperate. The 12-mile detour to town was costing us time and money we could not afford. Grandpa's medical appointments were becoming complicated. Grocery shopping required half a day. We were prisoners on our own land. But the worst part was watching what the isolation was doing to Grandpa. This was a man who had built roads and bridges, who had served his country in 2 wars, who had raised a family and contributed to his community for 8 decades. Now he was being treated like a criminal by someone who had been in town for less than 6 months. One evening, I found him in the barn, standing beside the old Caterpillar bulldozer he had used to clear the road in 1963. The machine was ancient but well-maintained. Its yellow paint faded, but its engine still strong. "Still runs," he said quietly, patting the worn seat. "Rebuilt the engine myself 5 years ago. Figured I might need it to clear trees after storms." I knew what he was thinking, but I had to try to talk him out of it. "Grandpa, if you use that thing to remove the fence, Sheriff Karen will arrest you. She will charge you with destruction of property, maybe even assault with a deadly weapon." He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much injustice for one lifetime. "Jake, I have been patient. I have been reasonable. I have followed every law and regulation she could throw at me. But some things are more important than staying out of jail." He climbed up onto the bulldozer and ran his hands over the controls he knew by heart. "Your grandmother and I raised 4 children in this house. Your father took his first steps on that road. You learned to drive on that road. 3 generations of our family have depended on that access. His voice grew harder. I did not fight in Korea and Vietnam so some corrupt sheriff could trap me on my own property. I did not spend 60 years being a good neighbor and a law-abiding citizen so someone could steal my land through legal intimidation. He climbed down and faced me directly. Tomorrow morning, I am going to start that bulldozer and drive it down to the fence, and then I am going to clear the obstruction from our road. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what Grandpa planned to do and the consequences he would face. Sheriff Karen was looking for any excuse to arrest him, and destroying private property would give her exactly what she needed. But I also understood his position. We had exhausted every legal option, and the system was clearly rigged against us. At dawn, I found Grandpa in the kitchen, already dressed and drinking coffee. He looked calmer than he had in weeks, like a man who had finally made peace with a difficult decision. "You do not have to be part of this," he said when he saw me. "In fact, it would be better if you were not here when it happens. Sheriff Karen will be looking to make arrests, and there is no reason for both of us to go to jail." I sat down across from him. "Grandpa, I am not leaving you to face this alone." He smiled for the first time in days. "I was hoping you would say that, but I need you to understand what we are risking here. This could go very badly for us." We spent the morning going over the plan. It was beautifully simple in its directness. Grandpa would start the bulldozer and drive it down to the fence. He would push the barrier aside, clearing our legal right of way. Then he would drive back to the house and wait for Sheriff Karen to arrive. "The key," he explained, "is to make sure everyone understands this is about property rights, not personal revenge. We are not attacking anyone or destroying anything except the illegal obstruction of our easement." He had even prepared a statement to read when Sheriff Karen arrived, a clear explanation of our legal position and the reasoning behind his actions. He wanted everything documented properly. Around 10 o'clock, we walked out to the barn together. The bulldozer sat exactly where it had for the past 5 years, covered by a blue tarp and surrounded by farm equipment. Grandpa pulled off the tarp like he was unveiling a monument. The machine was impressive even in its retirement. A 1962 Caterpillar D6, 15 tons of American engineering built to move mountains. Its yellow paint was faded and its steel tracks were worn smooth, but the engine compartment was spotless. Grandpa had maintained it like his life depended on it. "She was already 10 years old when I bought her," he said, running his hand along the blade controls. "Previous owner used her to build logging roads up in the mountains. I got her cheap because everyone thought she was too old to be reliable." He climbed up into the operator's seat and began his pre-start checklist, checking fluid levels and testing controls with the practiced movements of someone who had operated heavy equipment for decades. "40 years I used this machine," he continued. "Built roads, cleared land, dug foundations. She helped me carve a living out of raw ground and make something useful from nothing." The engine turned over on the second try, settling into the deep, rumbling idle that only old diesel engines can produce. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust stack, then cleared as the engine warmed up. Grandpa revved it a few times, listening to the sound with the ear of a master mechanic. "Perfect," he said with satisfaction, "ready to work." I looked at my grandfather, 80 years old and about to take on the entire law enforcement system of our county with nothing but an antique bulldozer and 60 years of righteous indignation. "Are you sure about this?" I asked one last time. He looked at me with the steady gaze of a man who had never backed down from a just fight. "Jake, There comes a time when you have to stand up to bullies, no matter what badge they wear. Your grandmother used to say that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right even when you are afraid. He engaged the tracks and the bulldozer lurched forward, diesel engine roaring with power. Today, we do what is right. I will never forget the sight of my 80-year-old grandfather driving that massive yellow bulldozer out of the barn and down our family road toward the fence that had trapped us for 3 weeks. The morning sun glinted off the blade as he navigated the curves with practiced skill, diesel smoke trailing behind him like a battle flag. The sound was incredible. That old Caterpillar engine roared with the voice of honest work and American determination. The steel tracks clanked and squealed as they bit into the gravel road, throwing up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. It was the sound of a man who had decided that enough was enough. I followed behind in my pickup truck, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and terror. We were about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. Once Grandpa knocked down that fence, there would be no going back to legal negotiations or bureaucratic solutions. This would be direct action, and Sheriff Karen would respond accordingly. Word travels fast in a small town. By the time we reached the fence, a small crowd had gathered on the main highway. Neighbors who had heard the bulldozer's approach, drivers who had stopped to see what was happening, even a few county workers who had abandoned their morning coffee to witness what everyone sensed was going to be a historic moment. Old Mrs. Clemens was there, leaning on her walker and grinning like a teenager about to watch a prank. The Henderson brothers had driven over from their farm, standing beside their truck with their arms crossed and expressions of grim approval. Even some folks I did not recognize had pulled over, drawn by the spectacle of an old man taking on the system with heavy machinery. Grandpa stopped the bulldozer about 20 feet from the fence and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was almost as impressive as the noise had been. He climbed down slowly, his joints protesting after the rough ride, and walked over to examine the barrier that had caused so much trouble. The fence was substantial, built to last. 8 feet of chain link topped with razor wire, anchored by steel posts set in concrete. Someone had invested serious money in keeping us trapped, but standing next to 15 tons of bulldozer, it looked fragile and temporary. "Folks," Grandpa called out to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I want everyone to witness what is about to happen here. This fence is blocking a legal easement that has been on file with the county since 1963. I have tried to resolve this matter through proper legal channels, but I have been prevented from doing so by corruption and bureaucratic interference." He pulled out the statement he had prepared, reading from it in a clear, steady voice. "I am now going to exercise my legal right to clear this obstruction from my property. I am not destroying anyone's legitimate property. I am removing an illegal barrier from my own easement." Someone in the crowd started clapping. Others joined in. Within seconds, nearly everyone present was applauding my grandfather's stand against injustice. These were people who had watched Sheriff Karen's harassment campaign for months, who had seen friends and neighbors intimidated and bullied by someone who was supposed to protect them. Grandpa climbed back onto the bulldozer and fired up the engine. The crowd stepped back to a safe distance, but nobody left. Everyone wanted to see justice served, even if it came at the end of a bulldozer blade. He engaged the tracks and rolled forward slowly, lining up the blade with the center of the fence. For a moment, he paused, giving anyone who wanted to object one last chance to speak up. When no one did, he pushed the throttle forward and drove straight into the barrier. The impact was spectacular. Chain link screamed as it tore. Steel posts snapped like twigs. Concrete anchors popped out of the ground and went flying. In less than 30 seconds, 3 weeks of harassment and intimidation had been reduced to a twisted pile of scrap metal. The crowd erupted in cheers. Horns honked from cars on the highway. Someone shouted, "Hell yes," loud enough to wake the dead. It was like watching David knock down Goliath with a slingshot, except David was 80 years old and his slingshot weighed 15 tons. Grandpa did not stop with just knocking down the fence. He spent another 10 minutes pushing the debris off to the side, clearing the entire width of the easement and piling the wreckage neatly out of the way. When he was finished, our road was completely open for the first time in 3 weeks. He shut off the bulldozer and climbed down to another round of applause. Mrs. Clemens was crying with joy. The Henderson brothers were shaking their heads in admiration. Even the county workers were grinning, though they tried to hide it when they saw Sheriff Corinne's patrol car racing toward us with lights flashing and sirens wailing. The party was about to get interesting. Sheriff Corinne's car slid to a stop in a cloud of dust and gravel. She jumped out wearing full tactical gear, her hand on her service weapon, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. She had expected to find us cowed and intimidated by her fence. Instead, she found us liberated and surrounded by cheering neighbors. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she screamed at Grandpa, her voice cracking with fury. Grandpa faced her calmly, his statement still in his hand. "I am clearing an illegal obstruction from my legal easement, Sheriff, just like I said I would." Sheriff Corinne stood in the middle of the road, surrounded by twisted metal and concrete chunks, looking like her entire world had just collapsed. The crowd of neighbors watched silently as she struggled to process what had happened. Her carefully constructed harassment campaign had been reduced to scrap in less than 5 minutes. "You are under arrest," she shouted at Grandpa, fumbling for her handcuffs. "Destruction of private property, reckless endangerment, resisting arrest." "I have not resisted anything yet," Grandpa replied calmly. "And you might want to check your facts before you start making arrests you cannot justify." He held up the easement documents he had brought with him. "This fence was built across a legal right-of-way that has been on file with the county for 60 years. I have the original documentation right here, along with survey maps and correspondence proving continuous use." Sheriff Corinne's face flushed red. "I do not care what paperwork you think you have. You destroyed private property with a bulldozer. That is a felony." "Whose property?" asked a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Robert Chen, our attorney, pushing through the gathered neighbors. He must have heard about Grandpa's plan and rushed over to provide legal support. Chen walked up to Sheriff Corinne with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what laws applied to this situation. "Sheriff, I would be very careful about making arrests before you understand the legal issues involved here." "Stay out of this, Chen," Sheriff Corinne snapped. "This is police business." "Actually, it is property law business," Chen replied smoothly. "And my client has just exercised his legal right to remove an illegal obstruction from his easement. The fence was built without permits, without legal authority, and without regard for established property rights." More vehicles were arriving. I saw the county commissioner's truck, followed by a news van from the local television station. Word was spreading fast about what had happened, and people were coming to see for themselves. Sheriff Corinne was beginning to look desperate. Her hand kept moving toward her weapon, but the crowd was too large and too supportive of Grandpa for her to risk any aggressive action. She was trapped by her own overreach. "The fence was built by the legal owner of this property," she insisted. "Mr. Davidson has every right to control access." "Mr. Davidson," Chen said loudly enough for everyone to hear, purchased his property subject to all existing easements and encumbrances. That includes my client's right of way, which has been legally established for 60 years. He pulled out his own folder of documents. I have here copies of all the relevant county records, including the original easement agreement, survey maps, and maintenance records. The fence was built illegally, and my client had every right to remove it. The crowd murmured its approval. These were people who understood property rights and legal procedures. They could see that Grandpa had been wronged and had taken the only action available to him. Sheriff Karen looked around at the faces surrounding her and seemed to realize that she had seriously miscalculated. These were not the isolated, intimidated elderly people she usually targeted. This was an entire community that had watched her harassment campaign and decided they had seen enough. County Commissioner Williams pushed through the crowd, looking harried and confused. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Chen immediately stepped forward to brief him on the situation. Within minutes, Williams was studying the easement documents and asking pointed questions about how the fence had been approved and installed. "Sheriff," Williams said finally, "did your department issue permits for this fence?" Sheriff Karen's jaw tightened. Permits were not required for private property improvements. They are required for any structure that blocks a county-recorded easement, Williams replied. This fence should never have been allowed. The news reporter was capturing everything, interviewing neighbors and filming the debris from Grandpa's direct action. This story was going to be all over the local news by evening, and Sheriff Karen knew it. She made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "I am still arresting this man for destruction of property and reckless operation of heavy equipment." "No," Williams said firmly. "You are not. Mr. Morrison was within his legal rights, and this department is not going to arrest people for exercising those rights." The crowd cheered again. Sheriff Karen stood alone in the middle of the road, her authority crumbling around her like the fence Grandpa had knocked down. The aftermath of Bulldozer Day, as it came to be known around Millerville, unfolded with the inevitability of a landslide. Sheriff Karen's harassment campaign had been exposed in the most public way possible, and the community response was swift and decisive. The local news coverage was devastating for her. The reporter had captured everything: Grandpa's calm explanation of his legal rights, the enthusiastic support of the crowd, Commissioner Williams overruling her attempted arrest. But the most damaging moment was when they interviewed Mr. Davidson, the man who had bought the land and installed the fence. Standing nervously in front of the camera, Davidson admitted that Sheriff Karen had approached him about purchasing the property, not the other way around. She had convinced him that our easement was invalid and that he could force us to buy access rights at an inflated price. The fence had been her idea, and she had assured him it was completely legal. "She told me the old man would cave in within a week," Davidson said, looking sick to his stomach. "She said elderly property owners never fight back when you pressure them legally." The story went viral on social media within days. Videos of the bulldozer knocking down the fence were shared thousands of times, usually with captions about standing up to corrupt authorities or defending property rights. Grandpa became an overnight folk hero, the 80-year-old veteran who had taken on a crooked sheriff with nothing but heavy machinery and righteous indignation. But the real justice came through official channels. The state attorney general's office launched an investigation into Sheriff Karen's conduct, not just in our case, but throughout her entire tenure in Millerville. Complaints poured in from dozens of residents who had been harassed, intimidated, or pressured to sell their property. The investigation revealed a pattern of corruption that shocked even veteran law enforcement officials. Sheriff Karen had been working with a development company to identify and pressure elderly property owners into selling below market value. She had used her badge to intimidate people who could not afford to fight back, targeting the most vulnerable members of our community. Within 2 weeks of Bulldozer Day, Sheriff Karen submitted her resignation to pursue other opportunities. Nobody was sorry to see her go. The interim sheriff who replaced her immediately dropped all the bogus citations she had issued and publicly apologized to the community for her misconduct. Mr. Davidson, faced with a lawsuit and public embarrassment, agreed to sell his property back to the county at cost. The land was designated as a buffer zone around our easement, ensuring that no future fence could block our road. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later, when Grandpa received a letter from the county commissioners, formally recognizing his service to the community and officially naming our road Morrison Way, in honor of our family's 60-year contribution to the area. The letter was signed by all 5 commissioners and included a formal apology for the harassment our family had endured. It acknowledged that Grandpa's actions, while dramatic, had been legally justified and morally necessary. Sometimes, the letter concluded, justice requires citizens to take bold action when their government fails them. Mr. Morrison's courage in defending his legal rights has reminded us all of the importance of standing up to abuse of power, regardless of who wields it. The bulldozer that had knocked down Sheriff Karen's fence was retired to a place of honor in our barn, but its legend lived on. People drove from 3 counties away just to see the machine that had taken down a corrupt sheriff. Grandpa gave tour to anyone who asked, always ending with the same message. Bullies count on you being too scared or too tired to fight back. They think a badge or a uniform makes them untouchable. But sometimes you have to show them that ordinary people will not be pushed around forever. 6 months later, our community had healed from Sheriff Karen's brief but destructive reign. New neighbors had moved in, drawn by stories of a place where people looked out for each other and stood up to injustice. Property values had recovered from the harassment campaign. Most importantly, trust in local government had been restored. As for Grandpa, he returned to his quiet retirement, tending his garden and maintaining the